you very much. Thank you to the Centre for hosting us here in this event, and thank you to UR for the invitation. My name is Andrew Copson, as you heard, and I speak, as the introduction said, in a number of capacities, I suppose. Firstly, I am currently the president of Humanists International, and have been for the last 7 years, which is the global federation of humanist and other secular and non-religious belief organisations. Secondly, for the last 17 years, I've worked at Humanists UK, and for the last 15 years as chief executive there. And Humanists UK is the principal UK affiliate of Humanists International, so it's the main humanist organisation in Britain. And in addition, my own academic work, as you heard, has focused on political secularism and on humanism and its history. So I've been asked to give a brief tour of the landscape of the non-religious belief landscape of Europe, specifically as it relates to humanists. Humanists International is, of course, not a European organisation. It is a global federation. It was founded in 1952 as the successor body to various 19th century umbrellas for the humanist organisation that had existed. But although it is a global body, you can see, if I show you this map of where the member organisations of Humanists International cluster, that a large prevalence of them occur within Europe. Now, to some extent, this is because in the wasteland of humanist organisations that curves through the map there, it's actually illegal to start a humanist organisation. There are a couple of dozen countries where that's the case in the world. But even if you could see on this map the one or two underground organisations, how can I use it? You want me to speak more loudly? Yes, okay. But even if you could see the one or two underground humanist organisations that exist in those countries, you'd still see a strong clustering of humanist organisations in Europe, because it is, in large part, Europe that has been the cradle of and is still the global centre of humanist organisation in the world. So to speak about the non-religious belief landscape of Europe is not inappropriate or overly culturally particular. It does have a certain resonance. What I'm going to speak about then, I've organised under these 4 headings. I'm going to ask the question, who are the non-religious? What are the different ways in which we might define them? I'm going to talk a little bit about a historical perspective on that question, which is a second possible dimension to discussing the non-religious in a generational sense. I'm going to talk a little bit about what the humanist philosopher Hector Horton in the mid-20th century called the two humanisms, which relates to the distinction that can be made between those who organise in humanist organisations and those who have no connection with humanist organisations at all, but nonetheless are motivated by implicit humanist beliefs and worldviews. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the humanist organisations or the organised non-religious in Europe, and that's where I'll begin to connect a little bit with the relationship of those organisations to the state, which is obviously one of the important aspects of the landscape. And running through all of these 4 points, what I hope to demonstrate to you about the non-religious and their organisations within Europe are, first of all, their significance, highly significant series of organisations and individuals that must be taken seriously in both academia and in policy, and their diversity. And I know that there'll be further talks this afternoon about the diversity of the non-religious, but I'll start a little bit of that going, hopefully, and look forward to hearing more about it later. Let's start then with who are the non-religious. Well, those of you who are more familiar with the social, anthropological, or historical study of religions and religious people will know there are many ways to cut this question. There are many ways to define the religiosity of someone. And just in the same way, there are many ways to think about the non-religiosity of a person or an organisation or a society. And to some extent, these are similar to the ways that one might think about religiosity. So here are 4 dimensions that certainly many recent anthropologists of humanism, and I think here of the work of people like Matthew Engelke from the States, or increasingly the sociology of religion and non-religious groups, people like Laurie Berman and the program that she's running in Canada. Here are 4 possible ways of cutting this question, of answering this question. So we might say that people are non-religious by virtue of their identity. They identify as not religious or non-religious. And we see in different survey instruments that people can mean something quite strong when they say not religious. So for example, if you give people in the survey the option not to answer a religion question, or to tick no religion, and then compare the proportions of people who choose to just skip that question, or to actively tick non-religious with the same responses if you don't give them the option not to answer the question, you can begin to see the percentage of people who are actively non-religious by virtue of their identity, as opposed to the people who are just not. They're just not religious, and it's not an important aspect of their identity. So that's at least one axis of difference amongst the non-religious by virtue of identity. Secondly, we could say someone was non-religious by virtue of their beliefs. And this really has been more the domain, academically at least, of philosophers, to some extent sociologists, but certainly in the English-speaking world, often as an adjunct of people who are engaged in the field of religious studies. And they have said, when we look at people who do not subscribe to a religion, and we ask ourselves, what do they believe? What do they think about the nature of the human person and the origin of the human species and where we are going and how the universe came to be and what's it all for, if it's all for anything? There are a series of responses to those questions which you could plot on an axis of more or less religious. Then you have to define religion, of course, which is outside the scope of this talk today. But belief, again, is a possible dimension to try to understand or define the non-religious. Practice is an interesting question, because practice refers to the idea that there are non-religious ways of doing and non-religious ways of acting, just as there are specifically religious ones. This is quite a new field. I'm only aware of a couple of papers about this, and Laurie Beeman, I think, is one of the authors of at least one of them. And it's new as well, because it's a field where people are beginning to apply sort of behavioural sciences to populations based on their religious or non-religious identities. It's very interesting results. So you could define the non-religious this way. Alternatively, you could also make a definition of the non-religious by ways of practice, because of the ways people behave in relation to activities that some people do religiously. Like, for example, funerals. We've heard about some of those activities. Funerals, weddings, rites of passage, celebrations of various types. So again, you see that within this third dimension of possibly defining the non-religious, there are again a number of different axes on which we could do it. And then there's the question of belonging. And this is something that could be, this microphone is a long way from me. Maybe I should elevate it somehow. Would that be better at that height? Well, oh, for a miracle. If not for long though, you know. It's fine for you, it makes me a little uncomfortable. Okay. All right, well, for the moment, I'll continue in this way. Ah, well done. Better? Yes? Better? Okay. I think we solved it. Translate? Yeah? Okay. Very good. Then there is the question of belonging. And again, within the category of belonging, which offers us another of these possible dimensions to understand and define the non-religious, there is more than one way of defining belonging itself. that the narrowest way, and the way we'll come on to, is that people might see themselves as belonging to a non-religious organization, or a humanist organization or some other organization. This, of course, would be the smallest type of non-religious belonging in Europe. More broadly, people might see themselves as belonging to a non-religious society. There are plenty of people within Europe who would say, well, I am, insert name of my nation or whatever it is here, which is a modern, liberal, non-religious society. So that's another possible way of belonging. Non-religiousness as a type of belonging doesn't have to be affiliation to an organization. It could also be an affiliation or an identity with another broader community. Well, these four dimensions of how we might define the non-religious, which of course are more than four because we've gone through them, you've seen the different possibilities even within those four dimensions of understanding identity, belief, practice, and belonging. They all, of course, relate to each other, interrelate with each other, and are very complex, just as complex as the same ways that we might think about religion or religiosity. And whichever of them, however, you apply to European society, in many places, it means that the non-religious are a majority of our societies. And in most places, and especially in Western Europe, they outnumber all of the non-Christian religious populations put together. And that is, I think we can all agree, a very significant fact. And speaks to the significance of the non-religious in Europe, which is one of the points I wanted to convey. Well, it's within the English-speaking tradition especially, but more widely within the international work of Humanists International, to use the word humanist or humanism generally to describe these organizations and types. This is not an international practice in other languages, and many conferences of ultimate confusion could be organized about all the different ways of using the word humanism and its cognates in other languages. But very significant among the non-religious beliefs of Europe is the approach to life that you would consider a humanist one. It's also global. A good case can be made for classical Indian humanism, classical Chinese humanism, modern Asian humanism in lots of ways, but it also has distinctively European characteristics. It emerges in a wide range of European cultures. It's a non-religious approach that seeks to provide a comprehensive way of looking at things. It's not just a belief here, a belief there, with some connections between them. It seeks to be comprehensive. And increasingly, as in the modern period, it's a movement of people that has encouraged conscious affiliation. And just to quickly illustrate the nature of that, if you Google this, you will probably find it more easily than me going through it now. In 1952, when Humanists International formed, as I mentioned, there was a declaration made in Amsterdam where the first Congress was held. It was renewed in 2002 and is being revised again this year for the 70th anniversary of Humanists International. And it describes the essential features of this, as it were, humanist tradition, which many of you, I think, will recognize as being at least, if not distinctively and solely and uniquely European, then obvious, easy to see how they fit within a European context. The essentials of modern humanism as defined in the Amsterdam Declaration are about reason, science, democracy, secularism, human rights, universalism, empathy, solidarity, freedom, and so on. Now, as a matter of fact, a large proportion of those Europeans who define as non-religious also broadly affiliate to these principles. And you can see that in European values surveys and in more detailed opinion surveys that are done in specific countries. So that's the beginning of defining and understanding the non-religious in general and a particular tradition within that broader non-religious population. The second thing I want to do is take a bit of a historical perspective, and I want to do this not for the sake of history, but because when you look at the historical, when you use history as a frame through which to look at how we might define and discuss the non-religious and understand the non-religious belief landscape, you see pretty quickly that although there are distinct generations of non-religiousness in Europe, none of those generations are, as it were, extinct. The ideas that propelled them at different times, the different priorities in different centuries, especially when it comes to their organizational priorities, persist and inform and to some extent explain the diversity of the organized non-religiousness in Europe as well. Conventionally, this narrative would begin in the early 1800s, but I wanted to just slip in right at the beginning some reference to the pre-1800s non-religious people. It's true to say that they are largely scattered individuals. We encounter them usually when they are being punished in some way. We learn about them through the details in things like court records of why they might have been punished. We don't know more about them really than that. But I mention them here as a sort of pre-generation, simply because I think that to pretend that there was a point in Europe where the non-religious did not exist is ahistorical and creates a false narrative about the non-religious today. But I'm not going to say anything more about them. The Dutch historian Hans van Dukeren distinguished 4 generations of humanist organizations, and they're the bullet points 2 through to 5 on my slide here. The oldest generation is formed by what he termed, in an umbrella definition, the freethinkers. These were organizations that also described themselves as atheists. They were radical. Often they would use other words like rationalist and secularist. They made an explicit rejection of religion, and they cared very strongly about that rejection of religion. That is the point. They are the heirs of the rebels of previous periods, but they are organized, and they emerge in a period where organization is possible for them. Because although there is still punishment, and many of the people in the organizations that I'm thinking about in the early mid-19th century were punished, they were imprisoned, they were very seldom executed apart from extrajudicially, but they were punished both financially and in terms of imprisonment. But although their activism was punished, their organization was punished, it was possible. And we see that in some countries, especially Southeast Asian countries today, where we see the same sort of phenomenon happening. A space emerges in which it is possible to organize and to speak, but the space is still quite small, because if you do speak, you suffer a consequence, you suffer a penalty for it. But nonetheless, the idea is out there. These organizations, these free thinkers, they formed a world union of free thinkers in the 1880s and held some very large conferences, rallies of hundreds of thousands of people. By the early 20th century, the German free thinkers, to give a sense of scale, had over 500,000 members. They were eventually banned by the Third Reich, of course. They were they had the distinction of being the first organization to be banned when the Nazis came to power. Hitler gave a speech where he boasted that he had stamped out the scourge of atheism once and for all. Of course he hadn't. But that's what tyrants think that they have achieved. So these free thinker organizations were distinctive for being explicitly rejectionist of religion and for having that as the central part of their platform. Van Dukeren's second generation, and I should say, in relation to the free thinkers, another distinctive thing about them, which is also relevant to the diversity of the non-religious in Europe today, is that they were very much motivated in culturally Catholic settings around Europe. So it was not very distinctive of historically Protestant countries to have had free thinkers in this sense, in this secularist, atheist organizing sense. It was far more distinctive of historically Catholic countries. Later in the 19th century then, you get what Van Duycken calls his second generation of the ethical culturalists or the free religious. These are people who largely come into non-religiousness with Jewish or Protestant roots. And the way that they organize in Europe is quite congregational still. There are still buildings across the continent where, in Germany and the UK especially, where these congregations met. And they progressively discarded theistic ideas and instead made human beings and their own communities the center of their ethics. Again, in the late 19th century, just like in 1880 the free thinkers formed a world union of free thinkers, in 1896 ethical societies from Britain, Austria, Switzerland, Germany federated themselves into an international ethical union. Again, effectively destroyed by the Second World War and by communism and fascism. But what they bring, as it were, to the diversity of modern non-religiousness in Europe is that you can almost plot a direct graph of the countries in which the ethical culture movement was strong and the countries in which humanist marriage is legal or popular today. So the organizational, the congregational, that aspect of things persists in those areas. And as I said, they were in countries that were historically Protestant, although there was also a strong Jewish element there as well. The third generation, in this historian's view anyway, of the religious humanists really needn't detain us very much in the discussion of Europe because it was largely an American phenomenon. So people like Dewey in the United States, they largely sprang from the Unitarian Church and were formed by a group of breakaway Unitarian congregations. And although they had some impact in Europe, including in Britain and Germany, they didn't really last very long. And then, from the mid-20th century, you get what Van Duycken, with a sort of teleological assumption, which isn't necessarily justified, sees as the epitome, the pinnacle, the end point of these generations of non-religiousness, the humanists. And the organizations that were most prominent here were in the Low Countries, in Belgium, the Netherlands, and in Britain, and also a strong movement in India, which is very much inspired by British elements as well as by indigenous non-religious Indian cultures too. And that leads us into this discussion that I said we would have briefly of the two humanisms, because as those organizations cohered, and they now are the vast majority of non-religious belief organizations, both in Europe and the world. Humanist organizations with the name humanist constitute the large majority of organizations for non-religious belief in the world. But as they cohered and set up their institutions, including the umbrella institution of Humanists International, they developed this idea that really there were two humanisms. There was, in addition to the affirmative identity and affiliation that they had, there was also a common sense humanist worldview. In their minds, they were going with the grain of certainly European culture, but also, as they hoped, a new universalist global culture in promoting these views that they saw as constituting a new majority opinion. Now, at the time, it wasn't a majority opinion. In the mid-20th century. There are indications from belief and value surveys, as I say, that it has become one. But these two humanisms, this idea of the two humanisms, is quite important as another way of possibly understanding the non-religious belief landscape of Europe. As the philosopher Richard L. Gregory put it, this is in his definition of humanism, a morally concerned style of intellectual atheism openly avowed by only a small minority of individuals, but tacitly accepted by a wide spectrum of educated people in all parts of the Western world. Now, he wrote this 40 years ago, that this definition, it already feels a bit old-fashioned. We wouldn't want to quite use those words, I think, today. But the point is, you've got the movement on the one hand, and then the bigger social phenomenon on the other. And that, I think, is quite powerful. We haven't got time to get into the detailed consequences of applying that frame to understanding a lot of what's going on, but it is quite a powerful frame. And it leads us to a question that is important, and I'm not going to answer it, I'm just going to pose it, of how important actually the non-religiousness of the individual's non-religious belief or identity is today. I don't care about religion one way or the other. I've never been religious. My parents were never religious. My grandparents were never religious. I have no connection with religion at all. I'm a lifelong humanist, and so is everyone in my family. And that gives me a slightly different set of beliefs and a slightly different identity from my colleagues in the office who were baptized and had catechism and had a lot of Catholic stuff in their life, to whom the non-religiousness of their non-religious beliefs and identity is much more important than it is to me. And I think that's an important aspect of diversity and something to understand as well. Well, at the end here, I want to come to discussing humanist organizations, as I said I would. One of the main ways that we would distinguish or explain the diversity of humanist organizations globally is by the social context of their security. You can see this map here. I'll explain just the context of this map. This map is a pictorial representation of the extent of discrimination and persecution suffered by the non-religious in the world. So where the darker countries where you see that are very dark red, very, very almost black, they would be countries where being non-religious, coming out as non-religious, trying to start a religious organization or expressing non-religious opinions can have you judicially killed. And then the lighter the color gets, until eventually you get the odd green country like Norway or Iceland, not many, there are no penalties at all for not being religious. So no penalties in your child's education, no penalties in social law, no penalties in family law, no penalties at all. Well, you can see that if in the context of the world, Europe, which is what we're talking about, in global relative terms, is a very secure context for the non-religious. Here are the countries in the world that punish leaving the religion of your birth with either prison or death. You'll see none of them are European. There again, the countries where we see the most brutal repression of humanist values, which is another index that this report uses when assessing the condition of the world for the non-religious. Again, it's very obvious none of them are European countries. And again, the countries that punish blasphemy, some of them are European, and we'll come on to that in a second, but those that punish it in the most severe way, again, none of them are European. So you can see that in the European context for non-religious organizations and people is in global terms relatively highly secure. And in fact, there's even been progress in the last few years within Europe. Here's a list of all the countries that have abolished their blasphemy laws in the last 7 years, blasphemy or blasphemy-like laws. And you'll see that European countries are well represented on that list. And there's ongoing progress as a result. When we look at this spectrum as a way of understanding the diversity between non-religious organizations, non-religious belief organizations, we see this spectrum where organizations, humanist organizations in some part of the world are completely banned. Let's think of this as a spectrum coming from right to left, So red is completely banned, yellow is discriminated against, and green is recognized in some way, formally recognized by the state. Now, if we plot against that axis the organizations that we know we have in membership of Humanists International, we find that in countries where non-religious organization is banned, our member organizations here, that's the Arab Humanists, for example, the Humanist Society of Pakistan, and the Humanist Society of Iran, both of which are underground organizations, not legally constituted. We see that the agenda of those organizations broadly constitutes a fight for acceptance, just an attempt, where they can even attempt it, to be accepted. Then where we come to the organisations that operate in countries that are sort of in the middle, and I put UR in here, we find that where the external context is one of discrimination or of inequality, organisations spend a lot of time campaigning for secularism. In those few countries, on the other hand, mainly in the north or western part of Europe, as I said, where the condition for non-religious people is much better and is almost totally secure, you find there the non-religious belief organisations are promoting a life stance. They may also, these things are not in isolation. Some organisations are doing all of them, but this is a broad spectrum, and it maps quite neatly onto the map of the political situation of non-religious people that I had here a moment ago. So you see there are organisations where they're fighting for acceptance. These are people who've been imprisoned for their humanist beliefs in one way or another. Then you find organisations campaigning for secularism, more active, and then you find organisations promoting a life stance, again in the north and west of Europe. So, what are then, to bring us to the end of this brief survey, what are the purposes of humanist organisations, or the affiliate organisations of Humanists International anyway, in Europe? There are four main purposes that humanist organisations, or non-religious belief organisations in my category, pursue around the world, and certainly in Europe. One is that they operate as organisations that provide a sort of community and a sort of fellowship for people of like mind. Two, they're educational organisations. They're aiming to promote better understanding, both in the public and sometimes in formal educational institutions, of humanist or other non-religious belief approaches to life. Thirdly, they're platforms for change. All organisations that are members of Humanists International, and all the organisations that I described in my historical survey, and all the organisations that I know of in the world today that organise under the banner of non-religious belief, are trying to change the world in some way. They're trying to change society in some way, as well as doing all these other things. They're advocacy, campaigning organisations. And the fourth thing they're all doing is they're providing services and support to non-religious people. Now, under all four of these headings, humanist organisations in Europe are active and diverse. And in all four of these headings as well, they have connections in some way or another with the state. In the first, community and fellowship, this is especially, of course, an important function in countries where humanist beliefs perhaps carry a social penalty, some sort of social disadvantage. But it's also important in places where they don't. Most humanist organisations in Europe do this as voluntary associations. They're membership associations, totally separate from any sort of official recognition. Elsewhere, state recognition has been extended to these membership organisations, most notably in Norway, and most often where the country in question has some sort of state funding for religion or non-religious belief organisations. Because what usually happens with state funding is that it's allocated in some particular way by some criteria or calculation according to a number of members. And so the main connection of community and fellowship with the state is through that financial framework. In their educational work and educational aspect, European humanist organisations are enormously diverse, especially in terms of the diversity of their engagement with the state. In England, non-religious belief organisations have official seats on local curriculum bodies, helping to set the common curriculum in public schools. In Germany, Belgium and the Netherlands, they provide the teaching in public schools of non-religious humanist moral education. In most states in Europe, they have some official standing with government as consultees when frameworks of religious education in schools are being derived. In advocacy and campaigning work, the connection of non-religious belief organisations with the state is largely as either recognised stakeholders or as consultees. So, for example, in Norway, Humanist Association is a member of the official multi-belief body that the state has as its primary consultee when it comes to matters that affect religion or belief. In the United Kingdom, There is a state civil servant whose specific portfolio it is to engage with humanists and other people of other non-religious belief organisations. But mostly, non-religious belief organisations connect with the state in their advocacy aspect through being consultees or sometimes outside lobbyists. But it's in the area of service and support where non-religious belief organisations have occupied an importance in public life and in relation to the state in many European countries that has been not only fast developing, but has made them highly significant. The provision of ceremonies. Funerals in some states are regulated by law. Weddings and marriages in almost all states are regulated by law. And in the provision of weddings, for example, where humanist marriages are state recognised, they now outnumber all of the religious weddings in Scotland. So there are more weddings by non-religious belief organisations by humanists in Scotland than there are by any of the churches. They're very fast growing in Northern Ireland. They're the fastest growing type of wedding in Norway. In pastoral care, so chaplaincy in a religious sense, but normally pastoral care in a non-religious sense. Again, there is growing state recognition and regulation across Europe of this. In the Dutch context, in the Netherlands, the humanist provision of pastoral care is now the largest single provision in the Dutch military. So there are more humanist state-employed providers of pastoral care in the Dutch military than there are Catholics or Protestants, for example. And also in contracted services in care and education. In many states of Germany, for example, humanist and other non-religious belief organisations contract directly with the state for the provision of social care, or of care for the elderly, or of sheltered accommodation. So in this area in particular, and in particular in recent years, there has been a large growth in a wide diversity of different services and support offered by non-religious belief organisations through the state. What does all this mean, I think, for the main topic of discussion in the rest of this weekend? I think it's no longer possible to talk about church-state relations. It's certainly there's a case because of minority religions that one shouldn't talk about church-state relations, but an even bigger provider of services, of advocacy, and of connection between the state and the individual is now provided by non-religious belief organisations in many European countries as a new type of intermediary organisation between the individual and the state. I think therefore we have to entirely recraft our ideas to be instead in terms of relations between the state and organisations for religion or belief. How we do that will be as diverse as the different range of circumstances in European countries is, and it will no doubt be a challenge. But I think it's certainly intellectually rewarding to think about and very necessary for the future peace and prosperity of a diverse Europe to take it on as a policy ambition. Thank you.